All right, well, good morning, folks. We do have a set of notes, and I'd encourage you, if you don't have those, we can get them to you, and I think there might be some help. We are on page 14, I believe. Yes. Now, let me just kind of review. Not everybody's been able to be with us, but I'll just very quickly review. And as I have said a couple of times over the course of the last couple of days, I am really anxious for folks to understand the narrative, to understand the story, to be able to trace the events. And as I say, I think we're familiar in many cases with individual pericopes, as they're called, passages, events, the Gethsemane and the upper room and so on, but to be able to weave them together into a coherent, compelling narrative is what God intends for us, I believe. And we've been using this outline, and very, very quickly, by way of review, we referred to Sunday. I think it's well conceived of or regarded as a day of Messianic presentation, Palm Sunday, the day when Jesus most formally, most, deliberately, and most dramatically offered himself as Messiah to that generation of Israel. And it did not happen by accident. We went through this. Jesus was wise as a serpent, and he alerted the city to his coming, John 12:12. But at any rate, as he rode into the city erupted as he had prophesied in Luke 13:34 and 35. You'll not see me until you cry out, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." That happens on Sunday morning. But we ask the question, given Sunday, why Friday? Given the fact that the city welcomes him as king on Sunday, why are they crying out, "We will not have this man to reign over us, crucify him on Friday"? And we suggested the answer is Monday and Tuesday, because on Monday and Tuesday, number one, Jesus behaved more messianically than ever else in his ministry. And on Monday morning, he seized the temple, drove out the money changers and merchants, and took control of the temple as Messiah, as the scriptures clearly state, that Messiah will come suddenly to his temple, Malachi 3:1. And therefore, for 2 days, as he cleanses and controls the temple, as he takes on all of his enemies in open debate and silences them and so on. But then as he leaves the city on Tuesday afternoon, he pronounces these woes on the Pharisees and the scribes. And what he is doing is driving the city to a decision. That is, they were happy to have him. You know, in the Old Testament, you have this messianic hope that begins in Genesis 3:15 and develops so magisterially in the course of the Old Testament. And the messianic hope has to do with deliverance from sin. That's what's at stake. When Adam and Eve sinned and found themselves alienated from God, and then it's interesting, God makes this promise to Lucifer, to the serpent, but Adam and Eve are happy eavesdroppers when they hear this message that there's going to be a seed of the woman who is going to undo the curse of sin. It's your only hope. And so the messianic hope was fundamentally and most importantly and blessedly a hope of deliverance from sin. But then as God developed this relationship with a covenant people called Israel, and those people were carried into captivity, he also is the Messiah is not going to deliver from sin. He's going to deliver, if you don't mind, from slavery. And the generation that encountered Jesus was happy to receive him as deliverer from Rome, because they knew they couldn't do that by themselves. But they weren't interested in his claim. They were offended by his claim to be their only deliverer from sin, because they were confident they could handle that themselves, because the Pharisees had taught them how to keep the law in order to be assured of entrance into the kingdom. And so Jesus has to make the case that if you're going to follow me, if you're going to give me your allegiance, if you're going to trust in me, you have to abandon the Pharisees, and that's going to cost you something. So given Sunday, why Friday? The answer is that Jesus deliberately, as he had again and again throughout his ministry, drove that generation to a decision. And the decision is basically, whom are you going to trust as your deliverer from sin? The Pharisees with their self-righteous, their doctrine of self-righteous works and so on, or are you going to trust in the promise, the provision that God is making in the Messiah? All right, so that's, and then we said very quickly, it was Friday night, it was Tuesday night, Jesus went back to Bethany. Remember, he's staying in Bethany. There's bottomless wisdom, strategy, cleverness in that, because he's secure there by reason of the laws of hospitality in that culture. But at any rate, Wednesday is a quiet day. On Tuesday night, Judas sneaks off to a hill south of the city called the Hill of Evil Counsel to this day, because that's where he went to make the bargain to betray Jesus in the absence of the multitude. Now a plot is laid. I think many of the logistical preparations are made on Wednesday, which is silent in the record, but I think a busy, busy day, as there is preparation made to spring this trap on Thursday night, because again, Jesus was so wise, he did not allow himself to be in a place where he wasn't surrounded by these adoring multitudes. Now that adoration, I like to use the word fascination. They were fascinated with him. He was the best show in town, but it didn't take much for them to, all he had to do was speak any hard word and they went back. But at any rate, it protected him from his enemies, and they were desperate to take him in the absence of the multitude, and that would be when he gathered for the Passover. So Thursday we called a day of, and so Monday and Tuesday we called days of Messianic proclamation, as he makes the truth concerning himself in both a positive way and a negative way. Positively as he demonstrates his Messianic character, but then negatively as he demands that they turn their backs on the Pharisees. And then Tuesday night the plot is laid. Thursday we called a day of Messianic preparation, first of all in the upper room, and then as he makes his way down to Gethsemane, preparing his disciples by teaching them and promising the Spirit and so on. But then those moments of bottomlessly, just gut-wrenchingly dramatic prayer as Jesus throws himself, well, I won't go back into it, but Jesus begs the Father, but he insists that not my will, but thine be done. You know, we've talked much about the humanity of Jesus, and I've encouraged you to take it very deliberately, seriously, and so on. And one of the dynamics of understanding the genuine, unfallen humanity of Jesus, there's mystery in it. In no sense does that compromise the reality of his deity, but his humanity is genuine. And one of the if you don't mind, ramifications of that is that during his life on earth, Jesus had no more spiritual resources than you and I. He was absolutely dependent upon the resources that God provides, and one of them is prayer. And Jesus depended upon prayer. And so you have that moment in Gethsemane, but then as he emerges, here comes Judas and a cohort of soldiers and the Sanhedrinists, and Jesus is arrested. And so you have Friday, a day of Messianic perfection. We're going to get there in the morning service, but I want to talk to you, finish the story here, because before the perfection, before the cross, there is prosecution. So now Jesus is going to be tried, first of all, and we talked about this last night, by the Jewish authorities, and it's really more of a hearing to come up with an indictment, and they're horribly frustrated. They want to make the case to the Roman authorities, Pilate, that this man is a threat to Rome. He's a seditionist. On the other hand, he's been so circumspect that they can't find anybody who has heard Jesus make that claim in terms that'll make sense to Pilate. That makes sense. Remember, we said he'd taken all sorts of Old Testament pictures, but he'd been careful to avoid the word Messiah. And so finally they gather and they're frustrated. It's the middle of the night, and finally the high priest Caiaphas, the great villain of this drama, finally Caiaphas puts Jesus under oath, which is wrong by Jewish law, and says, tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? And Jesus says, absolutely. So now they've got him. They've got 70 guys who have heard him say that he's Messiah. So now they're ready to take him to Pilate. They wait until the first blush of dawn so that they can, we talked about this last night or yesterday, but they can bring Jesus back in and get him once again, because they weren't supposed to have trials between sundown and sunup, so they waited until the first blush of dawn. Luke is explicit about this. And they brought him back in, and once again he confessed he was the Messiah. And I'm going to say, I think I said yesterday, but I'm going to say that's about 4:30 in the morning, because that's what they're waiting for. The first, again, not the pink sky, but the gray horizon, if you don't mind, the first time. All right. So it's about 4:30 in the morning. They now have what they feel is a credible indictment. And they bring him to Pilate. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about this morning in Sunday school. I think this is one of the most noble scenes. I'm going to hurry, but let me say, by way of introduction, first of all, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul makes us, says to his, in closing this epistle, Paul says to young Timothy, well, how young, I'm not sure, but he says to Timothy, I adjure thee, I urge you, I got my old King James language pops up once in a while, in the sight of God who gives life to all things. And watch this, I have it in yellow. And before Christ Jesus, who witnessed the good confession before Pontius Pilate. And some years ago, I stumbled across that verse like you do sometimes, and I just thought, now wait a minute. Paul is able to refer to the way Jesus handled himself before Pontius Pilate, and he can assume that Timothy can understand what he's trying to say. Paul is saying, press yourself into the mold and of Jesus Christ. And I just thought, I don't understand that drama very well. And so I decided to do a little bit of a deep dive, and that's what I'd like to do this morning. And so Paul talks about the good confession that Jesus made before Pontius Pilate. Now, what comes to mind? I mean, how would you intuitively, without giving it any conscious thought at all, how would you intuitively characterize the man Pontius Pilate in your mind? What do you think of? I think it is almost universal that he was a thug, a rogue, a cynic, and so on. I'm going to try. Now, this is not important. I have some strange fixation on trying to rescue the reputation of Pontius Pilate. But that's what I'm going to try and do, because I think Pilate is one of the most noble men certainly the most noble man in this drama, absent Jesus himself. And I'll just say real quickly, I think we're going to see Pilate in heaven. I think there's good reason in the narrative to think Pilate becomes a believer. But more importantly, what could be more important? But as far as the narrative, everything Pilate does is stunningly noble. All right, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me take you through. I'm going to hurry, and I'm going to take you in and out of the scriptures, but we need to get this done. And so, I have a picture here, and I'm not going to get into it. Let me just say this, that for a long time, there has been the notion that Jesus was tried before Pilate up here at the Fortress Antonia. There's no evidence of it. It was invented by the Crusaders. I could take you through it, the ancient history and so on, and all of the archaeological evidence. And in order to make the story coherent, you have to go, he was tried at a judicial gate on the west side of the city, on the west side of Herod's palace. And this is Herod's palace. Now, again, see it here on the west side. Herod's a dead guy, okay? He died in 1 BC, but he built this mammoth, fifth of a mile long, beautiful, stunning, well-engineered, dramatically well-engineered palace, and that's where he lived, Herod the Great. Now, Pilate lives in Caesarea Maritima. Herod also built a beautiful palace right on the Mediterranean, on a promontory that sticks right out in the middle of right out into the Mediterranean at Caesarea Maritima, the city that he built down there. That's where the Roman officials after Herod lived. But they would come up to Jerusalem for a feast. And Pilate was in town. Where would you stay? Well, he stays in this, and some people have said, well, he would have stayed in the barracks because it's better fortified. Let me tell you something. I haven't got time to get into this, but Herod never spent a night but what he was surrounded by the most impregnable fortifications. Herod the Great. Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean nobody's chasing you, and he was paranoid, and he had good reason to be paranoid. So this is one of the most fortified places on the face of the earth. And this is where, so Pilate is staying here, and it looks like this, and I'll not spend any more time with it other than to say, well, let me just say this. When you go to Israel, you probably won't go here. You'll have to find it yourself. I can show you how to find it. It's easy to find. It's right. But nobody understands this. This was only dug out in the last several years, and the archaeologist who dug it out, by the name of Shimon Gibson, walked me around here and showed me and so on. But I'm not going to suffice it to say that this is what it looks like today. This is what it would have looked like. You have these two walls, which are these steps approaching and so on. You have an outer wall, which has been right here. You have both an inner and an outer gate. That is an outer gate to get you into the courtyard where the court is going to be held. Then an inner gate to take you into the palace itself, into the courtyard of the palace. That makes sense to you? You can stand there and really recreate, this is what it looks like today, but I'd love to talk to you more about it, but let's get to it. So, Jesus now, it's about 4:30 in the morning. The Sanhedrinists have finally got it done. They've got a credible indictment. Jesus has said to them in their hearing just a few hours ago, he is the king and so on. So they bring him to Pilate, and well, let me take you to the passage in John chapter 18. So much here. I gotta. Oh shush. In John. All right, we'll go right there. John 18 and verse 28. We'll pick it up in verse 28. It's here on the screen. But it simply says, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas. This is immediately after he had, for a second time, after sunup, formally, had said, I am the Christ. And so now they bring him from Caiaphas to the Praetorium. The Praetorium is that palace. The Praetorium actually is a word that means the personal domicile, if you don't mind, of the senior official. It actually comes from the battlefield. And on the battlefield, the Romans had set up their camp, and there'd be a huge tent right in the middle, well protected. That was the Praetorium. But when Pilate came to and he would have come with his own personal guard, and when Herod had built that palace, he included a rather lush barracks for his personal guard, the Praetorian Guard, as it's sometimes called. But at any rate, the point, there were a lot of Praetorian guards. The Caesar had his own Praetorian Guard, but then every official had his own security force and so on. So at any rate, they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the Praetorium. It was early. And it says that they there is the Jewish leaders. They didn't go into the Praetorium lest they should be defiled, that they might eat the Passover. Now, that's a hugely important verse, and I'd love to spend time with it, and maybe we can get into it in the question and answer. But suffice it to say that you have these Sanhedrinists going about to commit the most awful crime in human history, and they're careful not to defile themselves by going into a Gentile household. But so Pilate came out to them. Now you listen. Oh, I'd love to get into the vagaries and the complexities of Pilate's relationship to the Jewish people over whom he ruled and so on. Suffice it to say that at this point in history, especially, Pilate was under obligation to work with the Jews, to work with the Jewish leadership. They could kind of get him to do their bidding. And so he had consented to set up his judicial apparatus to bring it out into this courtyard. Now, I want to take a minute, because we're going to walk through a story. So watch this. Let's say we are outside the wall. We're on the west side of the city. Here's a slope, goes right down the Hinnom Valley. And this is the courtyard. So there's a wall here, and there's a gate over here to get into the courtyard. We'll make the platform the courtyard. Does that make sense? Now, over on yonder wall, beneath the poster, there's a set of steps that goes up to a raised platform, and there's a carved bench there. It's a bema seat. I can take you there. There are remnants of that bema seat still there. But at any rate, so that's where Pilate, that's where Pilate sits. That makes sense to you? Now, on the other hand, just to the right of the baptistry, where those two chairs are, I want you to imagine a gate going into the praetorium. Gates almost always had, that is, gate systems, gate courtyards, had an outer gate to get into the courtyard and an inner gate to get into the whatever you're securing. So the praetorium, Herod's palace, where Pilate is staying, fifth of a mile, huge structures, huge courtyards. He had a zoo. He had a lazy river. This is the way Herod built this. So there's this mammoth, beautiful palace, and Pilate's staying there. All right, so we're outside. So what happens is, right here, they themselves then go into the praetorium. They didn't want to. All right, so we pick it up at verse 29. Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered him and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we did not deliver him up to you." Now, I think what's behind this is that, folks, a lot of drachma had changed hands to make this happen. You know what I'm saying? Undoubtedly, the Jewish leadership had gone to the representatives, the agents of Pilate, and said, "We want to get this man dead. He's dangerous. We got this plot. We need to do it before the city wakes up." Remember that. This whole thing is about getting the city, Jesus on his way to execution before the city awakes. And so they had it all arranged. And now they come, and Pilate comes out. I think he probably sits on his chair there. And here on the platform are Jesus he's bound by now. He's shackled. And the Jewish accusers. And Pilate assumes his official position, says, "What's the charge?" He's the judge. By the way, he's a duly appointed judge. He has every right to sit in judgment on Jesus, because Jesus is being accused as a seditionist. And Pilate's primary responsibility is to protect Rome. So, and I think the way Jesus handles himself before Pilate, even there's a measure of appropriate deference, because he has a right to sit in judgment. Does that make sense to you? This isn't some rogue guy. This is what he's responsible to do. So he ascends his bema seat, and he says, "What's the charge?" And I think the accusers say, "Listen, we got this all arranged. He's guilty. Just crucify him." And Pilate says, "No." He says in verse 31, "Well, then you take him and judge him according to your law." And therefore the Jews, and this is the leadership, John the Apostle uses the word the Jews, not always, but again and again, to mean not the people, but the leadership. And the context is quite clear. The city is sleeping. But now the Jewish accusers say, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." Now, I want you to notice this first, but we're not going to talk about it because we're going to talk about it after the morning service at the end. But John says, the Jewish leadership say, "Pilate, we can't put him to death." And John gives us a little note, says that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Now, just file that away. Now, here's the thing. This is what I want you to see. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again. All right, now I'm just going to tell you, there are 3 stages to the Roman trial. I'll be quick with them. But in the course of those 3 stages, there are 2 times where Pilate comes down off of his bema seat, takes Jesus by the arm, as it were, and goes into the praetorium alone. There are 2 times where Jesus and Pilate are alone in the courtyard of the Herod's palace. Does that make sense to you? Paul talks about the good confession that Jesus made. Other than the 2 times he is alone with Pilate, Jesus never speaks. He never says a word. So whatever Paul is talking about in 1 Timothy 6, where he says the good confession, has to be these 2 conversations. Does that make sense to you? This is the good confession that Jesus made. All right, now, let's follow it. So they go in, and he takes him in alone, and here in verse 35, he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now, folks, this is real. Jesus is not walking through some script he memorized an attorney passed or something. This is real. And it's impossible to overstate the infinite significance of what's unfolding here. But Pilate takes Jesus inside and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Now the problem with that sentence, that question is, it is cripplingly ambiguous. Think about it. Pilate might be saying, "Are you a seditionist? Are you guilty of what are you a threat to Rome?" What's the answer to that question? No. And Jesus cannot allow the record to be blemished in that fashion. On the other hand, and this is not nearly as unthinkable as you might suppose, on the other hand, Pilate might be saying, "Are you the legitimate Messiah? Are you the long-awaited King of the Jews?" What's the answer to that? Now you see, this is one of the moments where there were times in Jesus' ministry where the Spirit of God gave him supernatural insight. This is not one of them, because Jesus has to ask. And so he is jealous for the truth. Jesus is. He wants the record absolutely unblemished. And so he says to Pilate, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" All he's asking is, are you asking me out of your heart whether I'm Messiah? Are you asking me whether I'm guilty of what people have accused me of? And Pilate answers. And he says, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and your chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" So here's the point. The question is on the table. The only question, it's a legitimate question. It's a question for which Pilate deserves an answer. And the question is, are you a seditionist? What have you done? What crimes have you committed? Are you a seditionist? Does that make sense to you? Is that not what's going on here? All right, now, Jesus' answer is magisterial. I love it. But this verse right here, verse 36, I think there's probably as much mischief done with that verse as any verse in the New Testament. And it's a shame. I'm not going to get into it very deeply. I know that, by the way, our seminary and your church are an immediate mission match. We believe what you believe. But let me just say that there are those who believe that Jesus came not to offer the kingdom, but to redefine the kingdom. And that in point of fact, the Old Testament promise of a literal kingdom has been taken away and replaced with the idea of a spiritual kingdom. I hate to define it that way, but by spiritual, I mean non-physical, non-literal. It's just God's rule in your heart. So the kingdom is here. I'm not going to get into that. Frankly, I'm horrified by that set of ideas. I know that it's the set of ideas that prevails in our Christian world today. I'm horrified by it. But the point is, this is I always say, if one of those fellows accidentally drops his Bible, it's going to flop open to this verse, and this is their verse. They know dead certain that the Bible says, "My kingdom is not of this world." Oh, it's such a shame to read that. Number one, Jesus is alone in that palace. He's alone with Pilate. It's 4:30 in the morning. Pilate is a legitimate judge. He's asking him a very, very legitimate question. Are you a sedition? What have you done? And Jesus seizes the opportunity to deliver himself of a one-sentence lecture on Old Testament kingdom theology that totally contradicts everything the Old Testament ever said. I don't think that's what's going on. You hear what I'm saying? I think that's a silly way to read this. If you wonder what he means, look what he says. "My kingdom is not of this world." And he goes on to say, "If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight." So you wonder what he means by "of this world." Folks, listen, Pilate didn't live in a cave. Pilate, in his tenure, had never experienced a Jewish sedition, but just 20 years before his tenure, there was a gut-wrenching it was a horrible sedition that took him 2 years to put down and so on. And there was a history of sedition. And every time there was a Jewish sedition, this is what it looked like. Some pretender Messiah would gather around himself a militia, and he'd find some redoubt, some secure place down in the Jeshimon near the Dead Sea, and they would come out and they'd fall on caravans and they'd fall on Roman property. They'd rob the armories and so on. Pilate knew what a Jewish sedition looked like. And Jesus simply says, now listen, Jesus simply says, Pilate, The question, are you a seditionist? The answer, my kingdom does not come in that fashion. It's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight in order that it not be taken? Therefore, as he says, my kingdom does not come in this way. Now, he's not redefining the Old Testament kingdom. He is answering the question, are you a seditionist? Now, here is the remarkable reality that nobody pays any attention to, but it is absolutely staggering. And that is this: from this moment forward, Pilate is going to be absolutely adamant that Jesus is innocent of sedition. 5 different times. And folks, the easiest thing, this is the worst powder keg mankind ever saw. Oh my goodness, if that city wakes up and finds out this place could erupt, and both the Jews and the Roman leadership could lose their lives and their careers, and the easiest thing in the world for Pilate to say, yeah, okay, he's a seditionist. He won't do it. He won't do it. 5 different times. Now, I cannot overstate how important this is, that this drama unfolded in this fashion, because here's an important distinction. You're going to hear it said, and it's wrong, that Jesus went to the cross having been convicted of sedition, something like that. You'll hear say, well, you know, he went to the cross having been convicted, or Pilate condemned him as a seditionist. He went to the cross having been as thoroughly exonerated of sedition as it could possibly be. The only guy who has any authority, and the one who interrogated him carefully 5 different times against every impulse you might expect, sits on that bema seat and says, the man is innocent. I'm not going to crucify him. It's really one of the most noble scenes in all the scriptures, his refusal to do it. Now, here's my question. How came Pilate to that persuasion? There's only one answer, that argument right there. To take Jesus' magisterially airtight argument. Think about it. Are you a seditionist? And Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world, otherwise my servants would fight. I think Pilate maybe scratched his Roman chin and thought to himself, my goodness, I don't live in a cave. And this man's been going up and down the countryside. He's got hundreds of thousands of people who follow him. Not a one has ever raised a hand against Rome. They're probably better citizens than they've ever been. This man, with all the excitement of the last 3 years, has never, ever given any hint of, so you'd have to be crazy to think that this man with that kind of record has any designs on sedition. That makes sense? And by the way, this is why it was so important that Peter, Jesus said to Peter, put your sword away last night. So I'm saying, my point is that what you have here is the argument in the narrative that persuaded Pilate that Jesus was not a seditionist. Now, it doesn't end there. I got to be quick. Then Pilate goes on, and he says, well, are you a king then? Folks, that's stunning. Listen, I think Pilate and his wife were seekers. I think he was impacted. She was as well, because that has nothing to do with the legal proceedings. And yet he says to Jesus, well, are you a king? And I think he's asking, are you the long-awaited Messiah? And I love Jesus' answer. Oh, I'd love to talk to you about it, but Jesus was a premillennialist. Thank you. Jesus said, you say rightly that I'm a king. It was for this purpose that I was born, that I came into this world, that I should testify. And I believe it's an article with a demonstrative force. I should testify to this truth. And then he says, remember this, any man who is of the truth hears my voice. All right, well, at that point, I got to be quick. Pilate says, what is truth? And everybody's, he was just a cynic. I think he was desperate. I think this is a hot potato, but he has become convinced in his mind that this man is not a seditionist, that he does not deserve to be crucified. I think his heart is also impacted by the claims of this man, and certainly by the ministry he's had and so on. But for whatever, he goes out. Let's be quick now. He goes out, climbs up, and you can imagine, the city is still awake. It's still pretty much dark. The Sanhedrin are gathered here. They're thinking, okay, we got him now. Pilate walks up there, and he says, I find no fault in him. And right here, I find no fault in him at all. Folks, that's stunning. That's absolutely stunning. There's no cynicism there. If Pilate were kind of the rogue cynic that everybody says he would have just said, take him, be on with him. I'm going back to bed, for heaven's sakes. But rather than that, he says, I find no fault. Well, all right, quickly. When he says that, the Sanhedrin is beginning to say, wait, no, he's a seditionist. He's kicked up trouble ever since Galilee. And when Pilate realized, wait, I'm not in charge of Galilee. That's Herod Antipas. He's right here. He sends Jesus to Herod Antipas. Nothing happens. While he is gone, Pilate, sitting there perhaps on his bema seat, and the gate was constructed very deliberately so that multitudes could see what was going on there. And so now, at least Pilate could address them. So I think Pilate sits there, and you know what? The city starts to wake up. And Pilate comes up with a stroke of genius. I got to be quick. And he says, they bring him back from Herod Antipas. And because of the habit to, they would release a prisoner of Passover, Pilate thought to himself, I know what I can do. I'll go over the heads of the Sanhedrinists and I'll offer the people Jesus. They welcomed him as king on Sunday. They cheered him on Monday and Tuesday. They'll take it. So now they come back and Pilate goes, and he does. He says to the city is awakening. And he says to the crowds, he says, who would you have me give you? And they say, give us Barabbas. Now, again, this is their announcing their decision for that, he had forced them to a decision on Tuesday, me or the Pharisees. And then Pilate, I have to be dumb, but what happens is Pilate struggles to release Jesus. And one part of that is what happens is Pilate seems to say, I can't do anything about it. So he has Jesus scourged, which was standard before a man was crucified. We'll talk about it in the morning service. He brings him back out, and I want you to picture right here. Here's the gate going in. There are some long steps. Pilate stands right there looking out over the multitudes. Jesus by now is beaten, has the crown of thorns and so on. And Pilate says, behold the man. Have you had enough? And they say, no, crucify him. So Pilate takes him back inside. With this, I'm done. But he takes him back inside. This is John 19. He takes him back inside. And he says, quickly, and by the way, they had said to him, if you won't crucify him as a seditionist, John 19, verse 7, if you won't crucify him as a seditionist, we have a law. And by our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. That's why Jesus went to the cross, because he claimed to be God come in the flesh. I'd love to talk to you about it. But at any rate, when Pilate heard that, well, he was the more afraid, and he took Jesus inside. And this is the second. I said there are two times where you have Jesus and Pilate. They go in the gate into and notice what it says in verse 8. When Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid. He went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, I love this. He said, where are you from? Now, again, I do not think this is an intellectual, philosophical question. I think he is saying, what's going on here? Where are you from? Sunday, the whole city welcomes him as king. Now, everything I do, they insist, who are you? Jesus doesn't answer. And Pilate said to him, are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have authority to crucify you and power to release you? All right, now listen, I'm going to try to rattle your world, okay? I know the way this is read. I think it's the wrong way. Because Jesus answered and said, you could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Now the question is, what does it mean from above? And almost universally it's read to mean from my Father in heaven. Is that what you have in your head? I don't think that's right. On two counts. Number one, that's kind of snarky. You know, hey, Pilate, don't think till you're patting him on the head. You know, you wouldn't even have any power unless my Father. I just don't think that's the way Jesus is going to handle himself before a duly constituted authority. But the big exegetical issue is this, that if that's what he means, you can't make any sense of that word right there. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you, that's Caiaphas, has the greater sin. So if Jesus says, you know, Pilate, you wouldn't even be here except my Father in heaven and his providence caused you to be here, therefore, Caiaphas, how do you get from there to the therefore? Does that make sense to you? I can't make that transition. I'm convinced, and this is undoubtedly a secondary, but it's not. You run into it quite often, that what he means by from above, what Jesus means is from the Roman authorities above you. So what he is saying is that Pilate, you didn't chase me down. Listen, it's going to change everything, because I think what Pilate is saying here when he says, don't you know that I've got authority? I don't think he's scolding Jesus. I think he's begging, you're not going to help me here? I got to make a decision. I got the authority. I got to either crucify you or turn you loose. Give me some help here. I think that's what he's saying. And Jesus says, forgive me, but I like to think that maybe Jesus took those manacled hands and stepped over and took Pilate by the shoulders and looked in his eyes and said, Pilate, you'd have no authority whatever, except you were assigned this jurisdiction. You didn't chase me down. Now the next sentence makes all the sense in the world. Therefore, the real sinner is Caiaphas. He's the one who engineered this. I think that's what Jesus is saying. And why is he saying it, folks? I think Jesus is giving Pilate permission to go ahead. I think he's saying to Pilate, listen, and you got to realize, Jesus has to go to the cross. And Pilate has a role to play, and he's discovered a reserve of character that you might not expect of him. But he refuses to do it, and I think Jesus is saying, Pilate, you're only here because you were assigned this jurisdiction. You didn't hunt me down, the real criminal. And now what happens very quickly to be done, Pilate goes out. Jesus is perhaps standing here in this outer gate, now manacled and beaten and so on. Pilate goes up and tries to release him the more carefully. Says he tried, and then they played their trump card. If you don't release him, if you don't crucify him, we're going to tell Tiberius, the Caesar. And you know you've used up all your coupons back there in Rome. And so I think with Jesus' words ringing in his mind, in his head, Pilate, he doesn't condemn him to death. He calls for a towel. I picture him perhaps sitting there very ceremoniously, washing his hands. He doesn't want anything to do with it. I don't think it's cynicism. I think it's. Now, I'm not going to say it was not wrong for him to turn Jesus over to be crucified, but I think you have to understand. So I picture him walking down, perhaps going into the praetorium, maybe taking that rag and handing it to one of the soldiers and looking back over his shoulder. This is what he did. And saying, you do with him what you will. So Pilate goes in. So, in fact, Jesus is taken to be crucified. We'll pick it up there. One other point, folks, real quickly. And this is what, in my mind, really convinces me that Pilate, what happens is that it is Roman protocol, not in every case, but in most cases, to have a banner above the cross that announces why this man is being crucified. Because crucifixion, we'll talk about it, was not about executing the criminal. It was about putting down the sedition. And so they wanted him to know. And so Pilate writes, you know this, a placard. It's called the titulus in 3 languages. He didn't have to do that. And it said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. You remember the Pharisees, when they saw it, they were horrified and said, no, don't write King of the Jews. Right? He said he was King of the Jews. In other words, sedition. Once again, Pilate is going to refuse to pronounce Jesus guilty of sedition. He says, what I have written, I have written. I think Pilate put his career on the line. It is amazing. And I think that when Pilate wrote that, he had to have ringing in his ears what Jesus had said just a few hours earlier. You say rightly that I'm a king, and anybody who is of the truth is going to hear my voice. And now Pilate goes on record that he believes this man is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Now, that's a spin that's different from what you're used to, but I'm telling you, read the narrative. Find where Pilate behaves himself ignobly. 5 different times he announces that man is innocent. It is unspeakably important to realize this. Tease this out. Think carefully. On the one hand, Jesus was not convicted of sedition. He was exonerated as a seditionist, but he died the death that was deliberately designed for a seditionist. And it's because of that series of events. That make sense to you? All right, let me have a word of prayer quick. Thank you, Father, for this marvelous narrative, and help us to understand it aright. And Father, I'd pray that, again, thank you so much for the time together, and be with us in the service to follow. We thank you in Christ's name. Amen.